Welcome to our Lunch and Learn event entitled Mapping the Vulnerability of English-Speaking Quebec, a Composite Picture by Neighbourhood. Before continuing, I would like to acknowledge that while we meet today on a virtual platform, Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ghanaian-Gahaga Nation is recognized as the custodian of these lands and waters. Chojoge, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples, where we continue to reflect on the ways in which we can work in collaboration with Indigenous communities to form mutual and ongoing relationships that respect the continued connections with past, present, and future. And I can say that at QUESCREN, we try and continue to reach out to some of our Indigenous neighbors and talk about collaborating for different events that we do. It's definitely a work in progress, and we are open to suggestions for continued working together. This event is made possible through the financial support of the Secrétariat en relation avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. QUESCREN also receives funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University. So it's now my great pleasure to pass you over to our moderator for today's event. It's Mr. William Flock, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister at the Secrétariat en relation avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. William?
Thank you, Lorraine, and thanks everybody for coming. I gather some of us have had to face power outages and all sorts of challenges, and I think that explains some of the difficulty, the technical Lorraine was mentioning. I just want to say on behalf of the Governor of Quebec, Minister of Finance, we're very pleased to be supporting these Lunch and Learn activities by QUESCREN. They're a great opportunity for researchers to share ongoing and completed research with potential users, both in government and in community. As well, it provides a really useful forum for researchers to exchange around the work that they're doing. So that's the general piece of why we're supporting the Lunch and Learns. This one in particular, I must say, I have a particular interest in, and I guess that's why Lorraine perhaps suggested that I play a little bit more of an active role in it. I've collaborated with Warnke and Laura-Lee Bolger, the presenters here today, in a variety of settings, going back probably more years than I would care to remember. And I will say that in terms of, I guess, a theory around community vitality and the situation of communities, if we accept that place matters and region counts, then I think we can all have a huge vote of confidence in the work that Jan and Laura-Lee have done over the years. So I'm very much looking forward to this new emerging work that they're coming up with. I think it can help both communities in developing strategies and governments developing programs and policies to have the kind of understanding about the situation on the ground that this work that we're going to learn more about in a few minutes. So I'll stop there and just again express how interested I am in learning more about this work. So thank you, Lorraine. And I guess over to, are you going to do an introduction to Jan, Laura-Lee?
Jan Warnke is a PhD student in geography and leads the Geodata project at Jeffrey Hale Community Services in English. He specializes in analyzing healthcare access and usage by English and French-speaking populations using administrative health data and geospatial analysis methods to develop protocols for targeting individual and contextual factors. Laura-Lee Bolger is a master's student in geographical sciences at Université Laval. She has been working with JWCOM as a cartography and GIS consultant since 2006 and is currently developing expertise in online mapping by creating dynamic maps and applications with ESRI web products. So before I hand over the floor to Jana and Laura-Lee, I'd like to invite the audience to put any questions you have about the presentation into the chat, and we will address these in the Q&A period following the presentation. So Jan and Laura-Lee, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the occasion to be able to share some of our work. The work actually stems it's a byproduct of part of the geodata project that we've started at Jeffrey Hale's St. Bridget's, where we're trying to contextualize health service users. And we said, well, we're going to have to look at what makes up the neighborhoods and the populations characteristics which generate health service needs and so forth. And this is where we started actually, mapping out some of the multiple variables that make up the English-speaking population. So the project is financed by Health Canada, and the project is being run out of Jeffrey Hale and so forth. So what does geodata do? Okay, well, we're really assessing the socioeconomic context. We're looking at what's the context, what are these neighborhoods, where does this occur? We could do that in various different ways. Baseline data reports report on a whole series of very important indicators of the state of the population. They provide the basic characteristics and they focus on the issues of the English-speaking population, permit us to get at that particular aspect. The multivariate assessment, what we're going to be doing and what we are doing, is we're looking at how do these different factors, how are they associated together? Are they the same every place? Are they different in various different areas? Do they provide a different character? Do they create different types of vitality? How do they provide us the differences that we see in the English-speaking population? Okay, and they provide insights on how we can maybe solve certain types of issues, and we can also understand better how we can provide services. So both are required to be able to create policy measures which we can then adapt to particular issues. We've taken census data from Statistics Canada, from the 2016 census. It's 100% and 25% data. I've created a database using first official language spoken, 11 different age groups, and about 380 different social determinants of health. And this is from Census Canada, using geographies from Census Canada by census tract and census subdivision, and also by health regions, and it permits us to be able to get at the different locations right down to the neighborhood level. So the geodata product created this unique surface of census tracts and census subdivisions to be able to get at the high density population in urban areas, and also to be able to look at the population outside the urban areas where it's more scattered and so forth. And that's where we use census subdivisions or municipalities. So we've created this surface that covers all of Quebec, and then we take data from Stats Canada and we look at the various variables that actually cluster together. Okay, so we have this network of about 2,507 geographic areas, and in each one of those areas we have about 19 different variables, okay, that we're going to be looking at. So these are the 19 variables. Okay, these are the things that we're looking at, and we're seeing how they sort of hang together and how they vary together. Are they varying the same way? Are they all the same in every particular place? And that's what creates the clustering profile. It's a clustering procedure. If you want the technicalities of it, we have a working paper that will be explaining that coming out of QUESCREN in the near future. From this, we created 8 cluster classes. And that was our grouping. It permitted us to be able to differentiate neighborhoods outside of the Montreal urban area. And it also permitted us to look at the Montreal urban area and differentiate populations within it. So this gives us a particular type of geography, and we had to take it in various different ways, but we are mapping it, first of all, by census tract and census subdivision. So you can see some of the patterns. We'll be able to look at each one of those clusters and we'll be able to examine what are some of the major component parts of this that really stick out. These are all the 8 different cluster classes, and what we have is really the red that you see are the census metropolitan areas. Metropolitan areas which are large urban areas, and you have concentrations within them. And then you have areas that are outside. The black lines that you see are health regions. And the little colored parts, those are the census tracts and census subdivisions, the municipalities across Quebec, and they zero in right on Montreal. Unfortunately, with the PDF, we can't really zero in too much on this, but this shows you these are all the 8 cluster classes. And if you look on the right-hand side, there's a description for each and every one of them. We're going to be looking at each one of them, looking at the pattern for each one of them as we move along. And this is what characterizes some of the classes. You'll notice that there's always a first description, like Aboriginal ancestry or interprovincial or intra-provincial mobility. Those are the variables that are in order of importance that appear to group together the most in those particular areas, much more so and statistically significantly more so than elsewhere. Okay, and that's what's particular about this technique, is because it permits us to be able to say, hey, we've got these different types of people living in these places, and they're really significantly different. It's not just 1 or 2. There's a sufficient number to be able to say, yes, they are very different. Okay, let's look at some of these particular identities. Okay, so here's our first one, Aboriginal ancestry. This is cluster number 1. As you can see, the northern parts of Quebec, areas which are outside of Montreal, but also inside Montreal. It also groups together with that particular characteristic, interprovincial and intra-provincial mobility. Interprovincial means people that have in the last 5 years moved from outside the province into the province. And intra-provincial mobility means somebody that's moved around within the province. And the population, what's distinctive about it, it's employed. So if we're thinking about this, well, maybe these are people that are employed. There's a lot there that have Aboriginal ancestry, and that could be part of the movement of trying to find employment and to be able to be employed, so forth. And we find it right across Quebec. Okay, so it's quite scattered. The second cluster is interesting because the variable that really comes out most is this mid-level income, which is roughly $20,000 to $59,000. It comes out quite strongly, as well as the population that's unemployed and fairly young, 25 to 45, well, 44, and no diploma. Okay, so we're probably looking here at a population that's has seasonal employment or is working in primary industry. And it's off and on. Okay, so it's and that's where you find also the presence of unemployment. However, income levels are fairly high. So it doesn't mean that every person in that particular neighborhood has all of these characteristics, but in general, there is a tendency to have these particular characteristics. Cluster 3, again, contains Aboriginal ancestry and no diploma. But also, and this is very strong, that the Aboriginal ancestry came out very strong in this particular one, and no diploma, homes requiring major repairs, okay, came out, and unemployment. And they're almost all outside of the major urban areas. Cluster 4, again, there's a presence of Aboriginal ancestry and mobility between provinces, and also the presence of visible minorities and intra-provincial, in other words, movement. So we have mobility being present, and we also have the link between Aboriginal ancestry and visible minorities, as if visible minorities and Aboriginal ancestry share a certain level of vulnerability that's evident in this particular distribution of neighborhoods. It raises a lot of questions, obviously. It also permits us to have a look at some of the areas that are outside the major urban areas, although we have overlapping areas, and we'll see that later on. Cluster 5 focuses again on Aboriginal ancestry, inter and intra-provincial mobility, and visible minorities. A peculiar organization of variables, but here we're looking at really at mobile populations. Okay, we're not even including employment or unemployment or level of education that do not fall into this. What really makes this group distinctive is that fact that they move around a lot and they have Aboriginal ancestry or are part of the visible minority community. Again, that's cluster 6. In this particular group, we've got interprovincial migrants as being the strongest variable. These are people that have moved from outside of Quebec into Quebec, okay? Now notice they're fairly close to the border of Quebec as well. We don't see them inside too much, with the exception of the Gaspé, okay, which is interesting in itself. So there may be some development of the Gaspé that is attracting people from the outside to move there. They're also 25 to 44 years of age, okay, which are probably people, if they're moving at that particular age group, they're probably people that are working as well. And they have post-secondary education, so we're looking at skilled people and they're employed. Okay, there you've got a picture, okay, of probably skilled professionals of some sort that are moving into Quebec with an English background. Now, cluster 7, much more focused in urban areas, okay? Notice that all the previous clusters were pretty much on the outside. Now we're looking at really high density population areas, and we're seeing the clustering more clearly. And here, the top particular indicating variable is immigrants, people that have immigrant status, that have immigrated. They also have a high school diploma, they have mid-level income, and they also include visible minority populations. Okay, and we have areas that are outside of Montreal, but you also have an awful lot of neighborhoods within Montreal, in the Montreal region, as well as Pontiac and the Gatineau region. That's cluster number 7. And this is cluster number 8, which is sort of the myth breaker. Look at the characteristics of this particular population. Post-secondary education, high income, employed, 45 to 64. So here we have professional, some sort of professional occupational population that's engaged in activities which would be considered white collar activities possibly. High income, they're employed, and they're 45 to 64. So they're going up the social ladder, and we can see the locations as well. This is where it's all on the island of Montreal, not on the island of Montreal, but in the Montreal metropolitan region, and it's excuse me, fairly concentrated in the West End, Laval, and just towards the western part. It's a very interesting type of distribution, but it debunks the myth that we find English speakers that are wealthy and professionals and employed are found everywhere. Well, they're not. We do have these very particular neighborhoods, okay, where you have some populations that are less vulnerable possibly, but it means that we can't generalize from this to the entire population.
So the addition of visual elements such as maps that can make communicating the data very quick and easy to help people locate each individual cluster throughout the province. Working with neighborhood data, however, on a provincial level scale is quite challenging. However, it does permit us to see the greater detail in how the populations differ from one area to the next. So with this project, we've used multiple geographies that are portrayed on the map. So like Yann said earlier, we have the RTS, which is the Réseau Territorial de Services. It's a health boundary. We've also added the census metropolitan areas to see where we find the larger urban areas. We also, that's for the census metropolitan, we located the 6 biggest ones. So there's more, but we took the 6 big ones. And for the cluster groups, we used, like Jan said earlier, the CT-CSD data, which is comprised of 2 geographies, so census tracts and census subdivisions, which we also call municipalities. So the comparison of different cluster groupings can show us the difference between urban and rural areas. For example, like Jan just said, people living in urban areas tend to have a higher education and higher income when we compare them to those living in rural areas. Now, for this presentation, we stayed basically on static maps because fear of not having a really good internet connection, but we've also created a web app called the Story Map. So the Story Map breaks down different clusters and it'll give context to each of the vulnerable groups. So a Story Map is a web application that has been created that has a context and helps provide supporting information such as pop-up menus, tables, graphs. It'll help the people that are using the Story Map to go in depth into this information. So we can get a better understanding. We can click on the menu and see, you know, what population, what's the name of the area. We can break down all the different variables that were used to create this this project. This is our team. So we're a small team, but we work very hard. So you have Jan that's in charge of the data model. I am the GIS analyst. We have Jean-François Richard, that's the project director, and Melina Papalampoulou-Tsiridou, sorry, Melina, in advance. She's our project manager. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, folks. I see some comments from the in the chat that I'm just going to refer to quickly. A question from Susan O'Donnell about the category of Aboriginal ancestry. So could you explain that quickly, Jan or Laura-Lee?
Aboriginal ancestry, this is a Census Canada definition, okay? It's a question that's asked of the person. I'd have to go back and get the exact question. I can follow that up with you if you want, okay? So it's different than it's part of the ethnic origin, but it's a different question than ethnic origin, direct ethnic origin. That means that there's some descendancy, there's some antecedent that this person identifies with as being, you know, their ancestry has an Aboriginal origin.
Right, right. And as I recall, there's another question around Aboriginal identity, which is different than ethnicity. So I guess exactly. It's a self-identification, yeah. a more sort of current, I guess, self-perception. Okay. Kevin Erskine-Henry, I think it's a comment. He thought that there would be a larger pocket, I guess, of higher income folks on the South Shore, St. Lambert, Brossard area. And maybe that's sort of one of the questions I wanted to ask both of you. In the when you laid out your cluster classes, the 8 of them, I guess the first thing would be, and it kind of follows a little bit on Kevin's comment. To what extent does that reflect English speaking vis-a-vis French speaking? Is it the whole population, or are these clusters for the English speaking population?
This is only English data. This is all first official language spoken English adjusted for multiple responses. So we've taken a database only of the English population. We're not looking at the total population. So the total population may have slightly different characteristics. As a matter of fact, contrasting them might really provide some interesting insights as to what the dynamic is in that particular area.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll just ask a question because I think you've already answered a couple of others that are in the comments. But often, whether it's a government department or a community organization that is trying to develop a strategy to support the development or tackle issues and so on, people will work with, for example, administrative region boundaries or réseau territorial service boundaries, as you've laid out. So would it be possible to, for example, say, well, just in a given region, you've got 50,000 English speakers, to characterize how many of them fall into each of these 8 clusters, and then say this region seems to have a kind of a more of a tendency towards this type of cluster class. Is that possible? And do you think it's useful?
It's not only possible, Bill, but it's actually, we were doing it right now.
Okay. All right.
So for the working paper, it's going to be coming out. Yeah, it's actually, everything's there. We have the data. It's all there. So there's nothing to reinvent. It's a question of really understanding how the data is structured so that we could pull it out and really represent that effectively.
Okay, I'll jump a little bit in the sequence of the questions, but I will try to cover them all. There's a question about whether you expect that you might update this with 2021 data when you have it available to you. Is that something that you would hope to do? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We've already had several requests, and the committee at the Geodata project has already mandated me to order data for 2021, and we'll include MRC data at this point because we did not have MRC boundaries, which would permit us to bring it to that particular. We had the health boundaries, okay, the RTS boundaries. It was a really health-oriented project. We realized that there's interest and utility in various different areas, so we were going to make it much broader.
Okay, an interesting question. Shannon Bell asks, did you folks find anything particularly surprising about the data? Anything that went against what you previously knew or assumed?
Well, I found that the fact the Aboriginal presence was closely associated with visible minorities presence because of the other intervening characteristics, they have something in common. Okay, I found that an insight of interest, and I'd like to delve into that a little bit more. So from, let's say, from an academic perspective, I found that really fascinating. The fact that we have that cluster number 8 coming out, which is sort of your educated professional that's 45 to 64 and living in West Island. I said, okay, so well, I sort of expected that wasn't really surprising too much. But the fact that it was not really replicated elsewhere was surprising. Okay, it was not something that was generalized and found in sufficient quantity to be able to be noted as a cluster outside of the area of Montreal.
I put the note in the chat that the question of Aboriginal ancestry is very contentious in Quebec, and I just wanted to point you to the book by Daryl Leroux from St. Mary's University, who talks particularly about that. There's tens of thousands of Quebecers who claim Aboriginal ancestry to gain access to hunting rights, and so it's a big issue. And on that article that I just linked to, he's got a map of where the different groups are. So you might want to take a look at that. But just overall, I'll say I love your research. I think it's really important. And I'm really glad that I was able to participate in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wonder whether you could talk a little bit more about the map for Montreal and the idea that what you see there is kind of a myth buster. I know you've partly covered it. It's that, is the myth that it's not more prevalent? Is that the learned lesson here?
Yeah. I think the idea there is that I've been confronted. Yeah, well, they're pretty well off. I mean, there's no poverty amongst the Anglos and etc. I mean, it's that type of of myth that shows well, and that they're all pretty well off everywhere, and that's not true. Location and place really tell us that that's not the case. Okay, it's very, very clear. So. And if there's anything, we do have some concentrations where people are pretty well off. Well, that's great. I mean, if we looked at the French population, we'll find the same type of pattern, probably in the same location as well, which might be interesting to do next.
Okay. Richard Boudis has a comment on the technical side. He asks, how are the clusters constructed statistically? You have different variables. Do they form cluster-like factor analysis?
No, it's not. Well, we use factor analysis afterwards, but we initially, what we use is we reduce it, the numbers from 380 to about 19 variables by using various data reduction techniques. And there's a number of them, including factor analysis, principal component analysis. And statistically, then we applied what we call Ward's linkage. And we had to standardize the data because the data is very, very skewed, and it's also has various different properties, which we had to standardize it so we could make comparisons between the different groupings. It was tricky to work with. It's a tedious process, and we had to be very careful to make sure that we were capable. We weren't comparing apples to oranges, so we could actually compare one variable and its strength to the other variable, and then when we put it into the algorithm could actually give it justice and try to group it together into the groupings that we found. So we were using an agglomerative hierarchical structure, okay, of clustering. It doesn't mean that there's no causality implied in this. It just means these variables really have something consistently that's amongst themselves, and that it's worthwhile following up, and we can actually go and maybe do a little bit more research on those that are of interest.
Thank you. John Davids, who's done some work around visible minority populations. Hi, John. He's asking whether you've looked at the Gini score within the English-speaking community, also whether you can consider bilingual, Falls English and French, and to what extent they're included in your data.
We've actually, Gini scores could be used, as a matter of fact, to be a way of assessing the strength of the relationship. But with Ward's linkage, we're actually doing an analysis of variance to a degree, and we're looking at similarities in the variances between the groupings of the variables. So getting technical, it's a different procedure. But the Gini coefficient could be calculated to be able to show to the extent. To a certain degree, I think we could probably show that. I think what we're really interested here is to show the separation, and we're still not trying to show the extent of where one is really much more than the other.
Okay. Actually, there's kind of a follow-up. I guess we've gotten a bit technical here, but one of the questions would be then just to very quickly describe what the Gini score is and why it might be important. So maybe just explain to the audience.
Well, maybe I'm not the best, but yeah, the Gini coefficient is a coefficient that's very used. It's used in economics very frequently to be able to look at income and what share of income is what share of income you particularly have. We did not calculate the Gini coefficient in this particular one.
Okay, maybe I'll just add a comment to that. Is that as my understanding is that it allows us to see whether incomes are whether they're clustered, they're close, or whether they're spread far apart. And there is a bit of a theory that populations, communities that have a lower Gini score are in some ways more cohesive. And in that regard, I think previous data, I haven't seen the 2021 data, does show that for the English-speaking community, there's a higher Gini coefficient score, which means that they're more scattered across income scales. As John's pointed out, yes, it's a measure of income equality. So, from the low to the high. And I think previous work that even Jan and I have done together would show that we used to describe the English-speaking community as somewhat bimodal. They were overrepresented at the upper end of the income scale, but also overrepresented at the lower part of the income scale. So there was a missing middle. By the way, I do have the sense that that is changing, and they may be only more concentrated at the lower end. Another question, which I think is really worth pinning down, is what definition for Anglophone or English speaker did you use in your study? I think I know the answer, but maybe just for the audience.
It's the linguistic definition we're using is first official language spoken adjusted for multiple responses. So those people that responded that they spoke both English and French would take 50% of that particular population. So that's been calculated right from the start. So this is our base population that we use. Okay.
Okay. Okay. And that takes into account mother tongue, home language and first
Yeah,
official language.
that's right.
And rather knowledge of official languages, those three together.
Knowledge of official languages,
Then I think I've jumped over one that I want to just come back to. I think people wanted to, I guess, and I've seen it answered by Lorraine and her team, but my understanding is that both the PowerPoint and the links to some of the live projects will be shared following this presentation. Am I correct in that? Because people have wondered about that.
Yeah, it's a work in progress. So we'll be putting up material as we're producing it and validating it. I think one of the things that we do need is feedback and comments and saying, how useful this is, or how it could be improved. Or if you have insights as to what other things, for example, I really welcome the comment about Aboriginal ancestry, or the possibility of using a Gini coefficient and including it as a separate variable, okay, within the clustering, and seeing whether that comes in, or median income rather than particular income groups. I think there are certain things that we could definitely tweak in this one. This is sort of the first kick at the can. And we're getting results which are really quite interesting, but it opens up a horizon of other questions that I can't answer all of them. We can answer a few here, but we're going to have to prioritize and decide where we want to go next with this. And I know that I will be using whenever this as a basis for analyzing health service use. So I invite other researchers, other people that are doing research on communities and on population to be able to possibly help out, or if they want access to the data can be available to them as required.
Shannon Bell has asked whether you can speak to previous similar mapping projects that you looked at or you are aware of, with the specific respect to how you developed your project and how your project was meant to improve upon or differ from other mapping initiatives. I guess I'm presuming we're talking about language groups, and let's limit it to that. So what do you have comments there, Jan?
Yeah, definitely, because this is a continuity of the other research that I've done, because I realized that at one point we have to start looking at not just where one variable is operating, but if we're going to come up with some models and we're trying to infer what is causing what, we have to see how these variables fit together. What is the community vitality dynamic in any particular location and in any particular neighborhood? And this is what this permits us to get at. Okay, previous work that I had done, I was working with the total population. So I was saying, okay, the English population is found in the total population, and if we analyze the total population, we locate the Anglos with it, that will create some sort of a relationship between them. And here we're looking at just the English-speaking population itself. This is what's unique about this. I realized that I had to just focus on the English speakers and say, well, what's peculiar about them in terms of their population structure? Maybe after that we can start looking at the rest of the population, but I think that already provides us some insight as to where we might be going next.
Okay, I'll maybe just jump in, and in the interest of full disclosure, say that, well, it's 20 years ago now, that in a previous position I was involved with, Jan actually came and joined my research team at Canadian Heritage for a year to develop some mostly mapping capacity. And what I would say about, what we were trying to do and what we were able to produce back then, and in comparison to what we see here today, is that back then it was much more static. So we were developing JPEGs or PDFs of maps and then putting them into PowerPoints. There was no interactivity, nothing dynamic. That was a major difference. So I think they were useful, those map series, but they had a limited utility. The other thing I think that's worth pointing out, that in my view, what's different about this generation of the work is that so many other factors are being brought together. That whole notion of bringing many data points and trying to derive meaning through the combination of them, as opposed to, for example, having a map series that looks at low income, another one looks like age group, another one looks at education levels, and so on, which they're useful in a descriptive way, but they don't give the analytical capacity that this one gives. So I think, to me, those are two major differences. That being said, one of the challenges with this work is that it is more complicated, and for the average user, it's going to take some time and investment on their part to be able to really navigate and understand what they're seeing. But I'm sure that's part of your challenge, right, in disseminating. In terms of how else it could be made available to decision makers, public servants like myself and my team, or in other departments of Quebec or other levels of government. How do you see this work being useful and influencing policymaking? You have thoughts on that?
Coming from you, I think it sounds like a loaded question, but I would say if I were a decision maker, I definitely want to know where my constituents or the population that I'm serving, what the characteristics are, and what are the dynamics within that population that would make a policy work or not work, and then I would test it out. So I think it's not as if the tool is going to shape exactly what the thinking process is going to do. I think we have to match the needs of the decision makers and grow with them to be able to provide tools that are going to provide insight on the population. I mean, there's still people that don't use Excel, right? So that's fine. But if you have a map and you can see the distribution, well, I mean, we use Google Maps to be able to find out where our next pizza is going to come from. You can see the map here where the English community is. Okay, well, there we go. It's as simple as that. I think we're trying to simplify the knowledge that we have, which is fairly complex. Okay, we have an incredible amount of different types of knowledge that we put together, and there are techniques like data mining techniques and artificial intelligence and so forth, and algorithms that permit us to eat up all this data and then spit out magical answers. Well, here we're just saying we want to be able to simplify it so that we can actually come up with a picture that makes some sense to us and that we can actually act on.
Okay. There's a question from, thank you, Jan, a question from Douglas Sanderson, and I think he's just confirming, and I believe he's correct in his assumption, but the clusters, the polygons, right? Therefore, separate geographic units. I believe you've got, for the urban areas and the more sort of non-urban areas, you've got a little bit of different categorization. Maybe you can explain that, Jan.
Yeah, absolutely. The clusters are non-geographical to start off with. They're just a distance in terms of the values or the variations amongst the variables themselves, okay? So we're looking at what we call the dimensionality of the particular data that we're looking at. And population data is extremely dimensional, and it's really weird because it has all sorts of contortions and so forth. It's very difficult to work with. What we do with that is that we try to simplify it, okay? We try to iron it out and try to make it comparable so that we could bring it to a level where we could actually start mapping it out in areas. And then we see whether there are geographical clusters, okay? Okay, so we have two levels of clustering. We have the clustering amongst the variables themselves, regardless of where the location is. But then if we map those out, and lo and behold, some of them do group and they create these locations where you have a lot of people. Those people, they didn't say, hey, we're all of this type, we're going to move there. They don't, okay? But what we're doing is we're actually tracking community vitality. We're actually showing where the natural tendency of populations is to coalesce through all sorts of forces in particular areas and locations. And that's what's fascinating. I think that's exploring the landscape in a different way.
I saw one from Wendy D'Souza. Hi, Wendy. Another data geek. I don't mean me, I mean Jan. Jan, is the website that you have developed to look at various Sensa data layers still available and updated? Sorry, I have lost track of it because of the pandemic.
Okay, Wendy. We've had so many different websites up in various different. This one here, we now it's using a platform which is more permanent and which we can add to, and we can. So it's sort of a gateway that permits us to have an insight, and we will maintain this as long as the geodata project is maintained. Okay, unless unless Concordia wants to maintain at some point, I don't know. Throwing that out. on the table. So we'll see where that goes and where the utility was going to be. But the thing is that we're democratizing the process. The information is there and can be disseminated, and it's available to everybody.
A couple of questions. Richard Baudis wanted to know about the clusters. So could you be looking at with a background of, for example, provincial electoral districts or administrative regions? Is that doable?
Within each one of the administrative districts, you'll have all these little neighborhoods, okay, scattered throughout. And this goes back to one of the questions that you asked, Bill. Okay, we can then say, okay, out of the 8 groups in this administrative district, we have how many people in each particular group, okay? And yes, we can do that. We are doing it actually right now. We are compiling the data. So, but to show this visually, no, we can't say that that administrative district is predominantly just one particular cluster type. It's not, unless it were, okay? But it's not. It's that there's a complexity in each particular administrative region. Which one predominates? Yes, we can find out.
Okay. Okay. Penny Rankin asks, is there data on homelessness that's built into your model on homelessness?
That's very difficult to come to, okay? To come up with data on homelessness, it can be superimposed. Don't forget that if somebody does do a survey, and there was a survey in Montreal of homelessness, okay, where people actually counted people that were sleeping in different places and on the street and elsewhere. If you map that out, okay, and you have a way of actually aggregating that information, you could overlay this on the clustering. Okay, so any other data can be overlaid on this data here, and we can draw our conclusions from that. And that's the beauty of creating these layers of information.
Okay. In fact, I think Kevin Erskine Henry's just added a comment to the chat where he's suggesting that clusters can form around transportation links. You know, for example, the metros, REM, trains, city buses, and so on. So I'm presuming that you could add a layer showing those transportation links and see how that seems to join up with the clusters that you can observe with your method.
Absolutely, absolutely. Laura-Lee very often will superimpose different types of layers, and we just, and we just, when we're looking at wellness centers, where we're looking at various different types of, institutions and so forth, and we look at those, and all of a sudden you're starting to get a fairly complex picture, but a very interesting one at the same time.
So at the end of the presentation, I shared a slide showing our story map. People are asking for the link, but at the moment it is not made public because it's still a work in progress. So a story map like this permits you, like I said, there's no text or anything yet because we're still developing it. But like once we're in a story map, what we didn't have earlier in the PowerPoint, we can zoom in. So if I click, here we go. So this is how the map becomes interactive. So we can click a polygon, and so there's multiple polygons here. So we can click and have various information on what's in this polygon. And if this serves me okay, so you see we do have MRC data. We have linked the census tract and the census subdivisions to the MRC, but we have so like here, this is what I was saying, that my numbers are not edited, but we have all the different variables mapped, so we can use them individually. So that's it. This is the kind of a story map that we're building that is not public yet. So I will send the PDF of the presentation, but the link will not be active probably until we get our white paper in.
Yeah, I think we might put out some initial data and then just simply add to it, Laura-Lee. I think there's some basic things that we could actually put in fairly quickly. But then as we have to develop the narrative has to be developed around this because there's a lot of material in there, and I think a lot of questioning as well.
Oh, okay. Somebody else, Jennifer Crane, has suggested that it might be interesting to compare the map with, I guess, a layer showing the section 29.1 municipalities, those that are understood to be to have a right to deliver services in both languages. I think I'll just maybe close here by thanking Jan and Laura-Lee. It's very interesting, very promising work. I can see that for those interested in developing policy, developing strategies to respond to the real needs of different populations, this work is groundbreaking and I think very promising. So I look forward to seeing more of the work as it develops, and I'll certainly encourage other people that we interact with in government to take note of it and to learn from it and to apply it. So, and again, thank you, QUESCREN and Lorraine and Patrick and the team over there, Anna Hunt, for doing a great job again of hosting these lunch and learns. I think they're a great opportunity to really build knowledge and share knowledge. So thank you very much. Lorraine, do you want to have the last word?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Flock. So thanks to everyone for attending today's event. We always want to hear your feedback, and we invite you to fill out the evaluation form for today's lunch and learn that will be linked in the chat. Stay tuned for upcoming events in our series. The best way to learn about what will be coming up is to sign up for our newsletter. And if you haven't already, Anna will put the link in the chat to subscribe, or you can follow us on Facebook. In closing, I would like to acknowledge that this event is made possible through the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, ably represented by William Flock here today. QUESCREN also receives funding from Department of Canadian Heritage, Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University. And thanks again to Jan, Laura-Lee, and Mr. Flock for attending. Have a great day and see you next time.
Thank you.